Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Tonight is Monday, April 13th. And I know everybody in the world, literally everybody in the world, is dealing with something that's relevant to the topic tonight, which is how to deal with anxiety, stress, and our family in close quarters, right? That is a challenge that we're all sharing right now. And there's a tremendous amount of information out there about this. And we've held several of these broadcasts to kind of help people through this. But I thought I would hold another one and present some ideas. When things like this happen, often it takes me a little while to kind of digest what's happening and to come up with some thoughts and ideas because I'm dealing with the stress myself. I'm dealing with the transformation myself. So after I've had a few weeks to kind of digest it, I have some more thoughts on the matter that we didn't talk about previously. I want to start with this idea, this quote. The process we are all going through is grief. We are each grieving something similar and also something unique. There's something similar in all of our grief and something unique. And these losses that we're all experiencing will exacerbate our already difficult situations. And so if you have a child in our program, if you're dealing with a loved one with mental illness or addiction issues, if you yourself struggle with depression and anxiety, this situation, the pandemic and the social distancing and the sheltering in place, this is going to exacerbate that. It's going to add fuel to that already difficult situation. I was thinking about this the last couple of days, and I don't think I can overstate this, and I'm going to talk about this more this evening, but in almost every question that I think about with regard to mental health, I think a core principle is self-love, self-acceptance, a practice of kindness towards ourselves. Because with that, we erase the shame, we erase the defense, we erase the need to show up perfectly or to do it well. We give ourselves permission to be fallible and human. So tonight I'm going to talk about ways that we can understand, insights that we can have that can help us understand ourselves, have compassion towards ourselves. I say this all the time. I love the lens of psychotherapy, psychology. I love the lens of psychotherapy and psychology because I think more than anything, it offers us understanding and compassion towards ourselves and towards everybody else. Dr. Harriet Lerner wrote a great book, many great books. We're big fans of hers. In fact, she's going to join the podcast here in the next couple of weeks with me. She wrote a great book on anxiety and fear, and I took a few quotes from it. She said, "Good self-esteem also requires that we view our vulnerabilities and limitations with curiosity, patience, and humor. Nobody is perfect, and we can all benefit from working on ourselves. But the process of self-observation, reflection, and change is basically a self-loving task. It will not flourish in an atmosphere of terminal seriousness, self-flagellation, or self-blame." Right? And when you think about it, we don't want to reduce psychology or psychotherapy into too simple of a term or a mindset. But think about people that show up in your life upset, frustrated. Think about moments when you react with less than a patient response. If we had self-love mixed in there, a good amount of that, we could easily move through these experiences, right? We could move through the conflict. We could move through the difficulty, the mood that we were feeling. We could move through our own mistakes more easily, giving ourselves forgiveness and then showing up to the other person with the ability for them to feel any of their feelings. So it really is a core tenet. Now, and I've said this many, many times, I'm actually in some ways surprised by this, but when I think about it, it's not so surprising. So many of the clients that I've worked with in my years as a therapist have been afraid to give up shame and guilt, have been afraid to give up judgment of themselves. They believe that a good, quick kick in the pants is the cure. And while that idea that getting a kick in our butts is going to wake us up, and it does, right? In the short term, we can be motivated by fear and by punishment. Absolutely. But over the long run, in the long game, it comes at the cost of the self, of our authentic and real selves, of our deepest, most genuine and highest self. Now, the difficulty is that we don't know what to replace it with. We don't know what to replace motivation, the fear in our motivation with. We don't know what to put in its place. And what I like to offer is love. You replace it with love, love for yourself and love for everybody else. I will admit that things get messy in the middle. When we let go of shame and guilt and we start to cross the bridge over to love, inspired motivation for ourselves, our behavior, and for everybody else, there's a messy place in the middle where we don't know the difference between right and wrong. We don't know what to do. We experiment with what it means to be a self. But on the other side, and that's why therapists and teachers and thinkers in the field of psychology will talk about a crisis. We'll talk about, a midlife crisis or a crisis that we go through in our life. Even Brene Brown talks about, I've shared this before, she talks about in one of her famous TED Talks that she was going through a crisis and her therapist called it an awakening. Sometimes people will say, gosh, my friend's been in therapy or I've been in therapy for a few years now and I'm worse off than when I began. And my therapist, Jamie Gill, always teaches you're actually not worse off than you began. You thought you were in a better place than you actually were. But there's so much of this is about undoing. And right now, we're all being asked to spend more time with ourselves without our defenses than most of us have in our entire lifetime. I used to say about wilderness therapy, I used to say that wilderness therapy is like life, only more. One of my early mentors told me that wilderness therapy is the time to spend time with yourself and see how you like the company. I've taught for years about how wilderness therapy takes away creature comforts, takes away even healthy distractions like reading a good novel. Nobody on this broadcast, listening to this broadcast, would try to convince anyone that reading good literature is a bad thing. But sometimes we remove those healthy distractions, right? And we invite a kind of inward focused mindfulness, right? That's in essence what wilderness therapy is. You're taking away distractions, you're taking away things that would provide an escape, and you're asking somebody to look inward. I remember one day I was sitting with a young man. Actually, I was sitting with my staff, and we were going over the week's treatment plan for the group. And one of the young men walks up, he's 16 or 17-year-old, and he says, do I have to take a bath? We have these things called Billy baths that they take twice a week. And he says, do I have to take a bath? And the staff says, yes, you do. And he says, it's just so miserable and I'm going to get dirty right away anyway. And the staff started to say something and I interrupted the staff. He started to reassure him and talk about the importance of it. And I just said to the young man, I said, it is hard out here, isn't it? It's really inconvenient out here. And you're right, you're probably going to get dirty from the time you leave the shelter where the bath is to the group. You'll probably get dirty, the dust is flying, and it's a hot summer day. And after the student walked away, I turned to the staff and I said, look, it's hard out here. It's painful. You can take nothing for granted, even cleaning yourself. And because of that, you develop deep gratitude, appreciation for what you have. You recognize that the thing that is valuable is the thing that you have to work for. Right? There are so many valuable lessons. I had somebody visit my group one time, and they worked for the State Department, and they worked over in a country that had a lot of poverty. And they said some of the happiest people I've ever seen are people living just like the wilderness students out here. So this time, not wished for or designed by any of us, is a time much like wilderness therapy where we're asked to look inward. Now, most of us have roofs over our head. Some of us are struggling with finances because our work is in peril or at risk. Right? There's varying threats that are facing all of us, but we're all in some ways limited in experiencing some loss. Even the parents that we work with here at Evoke, you don't have the same choices. I keep getting asked questions by people that I always knew the answer to in the old days, right? The old days a month and a half ago, because COVID wasn't in place, right? It becomes a variable that doesn't make the simplest of decisions simple anymore. So it's important that we be patient with ourselves and our grief. Dr. Lerner says later in The Dance of Fear, the more you try to make fear go away, she calls it an impossible dream, rather than learning to function with it, the worse you will feel about yourself. You will let fear stop you from doing what you need to do. You will mistakenly see yourself as a weak and impaired individual rather than a strong, competent person who happens to have an overactive fear response. We have to walk through it. We have to face it. In Joseph Campbell, the philosopher's paradigm, he refers to fear. He talks about it being embodied in a dragon. And he makes an important distinction that fear in European mythology is embodied by a dragon. In Eastern philosophy, it's something else. It means wisdom and something else. So it depends on the culture. But in his way of thinking, he talks about this very common motif of a dragon. And he says when you run from the dragon, it gets larger, becomes more powerful. But when you face it and walk towards it, it diminishes it. And that's what happens with fear. And there's no way out of it. I think I told this story on a previous broadcast, not in the last couple of weeks, but I'll retell it here because it applies. My wife and I went to couples therapy. We go to individual therapy every week. We both have for more than 21 years. But something was coming up because my 12-year-old was entering adolescence, and we started to have an old conversation that we had with our older children about our older children during their adolescence. And so we went to therapy. In fact, here's what happened. I said, I want to come to therapy. I want you to come to therapy with me tomorrow because I want to talk about something that I think we could use a little help with, negotiating. And I said, but I need you to sit out. It was my session. She had already had her session. So I said, I need you to sit outside for 15 minutes because I'm going to complain about you. I'm going to talk about what a horrible person you are so that when you get in there, that'll all be gone and I can just talk with compassion. So we laughed and it was true. She stayed out in the car and I called her in after about 15 minutes after I'd complained about her and vented about her. And then she came in and then we could have a conversation because I'd taken care of the feelings of anger that I was having. And then I could be compassionate with her. So we started talking about this and she started describing her fear about entering this age with my daughter. She related to some trauma she had in adolescence and didn't want our youngest to experience that. And as she started to explain her fear, she said, I'm just afraid. And then she started to explain that our therapist, whom we both love and trust, stopped her and said, that's it. You're afraid. And she said, yeah, but don't I need to explain myself? And the therapist said, I don't think so. And my wife's eyes filled up with tears and started streaming down her face. And she looked at me and she said, I'm just scared. And I reached over and I touched her hand and I said, that is so easy to connect to. And then she's been practicing that ever since. In fact, just before the shelter in place order was given and we started to practice it, we were out. It was our last time out to dinner, hopefully not forever. And we were driving to the restaurant, to the ramen restaurant in Salt Lake City. And my wife said, I'm scared. Nothing else. And my son from the back seat said, Mom's been saying that lately. She's been saying that she's scared without giving an explanation. And I reached over and touched her hand and just let her know that I was with her. Fear lies to us. Fear tells us to run. Fear tells us that it's not safe, right? And it's difficult to sit with, but sometimes we have to. And in this environment, all of us have to sit with more than we would like. All of us have to face it. My therapist, who's 80 years old, she was describing the same session. She says, if you two leave today and I go home, go to my room and I get scared, I'm just going to have to sit with it. I'm going to have to sit with my fear. There's no place for it to go. Dr. Lerner goes on to say, but when anxiety operates as a chronic underground force, we may fail to identify it as the culprit behind our poor functioning. We just feel bad about ourselves, which of course revs up our anxiety even more. It is a part of our lives, right? It is I don't want to say the enemy because that makes it sound like something that you can get rid of or kill off. But fear is the issue. Fear is the issue. The reason that people love heroin and opiates and alcohol and other drugs and restricting their food and cutting on themselves is because it takes away pain and fear, right? You pump the brain full of dopamine, the pleasure, the brain in our body that signals pleasure, and the fear goes away. And it's peaceful, right? That's why people like it. That's why they do it. And of course, the treatment or the recovery of such self-medicating things is to go through it. Now, important, and I'll talk about this as we go along tonight, important that we learn to sit with somebody who can sit with our fear. Understand that, right? You sit with somebody who can sit with their fear. When my father was passing away, we did he lives far away. We did a Zoom call with him. And I noticed everybody in my family talking about it'll be okay and you can make it through it. And clearly he wasn't going to be okay. And clearly he was ready to go. And he couldn't talk at this point. But everybody wanted to say their last goodbyes. And I was watching this. It was so fascinating to me. They were saying things like, we'll see you in a little while. We'll visit you after you get out of the hospital. And he clearly was not going to get out of the hospital. He had multiple issues. And I was just watching my entire family run away from their fear instead of leaning into it. What I wanted to say, I just said, I love you, Dad. But what I wanted to say was, you can go if you need to. You don't have to fight it anymore. It's okay. We'll be okay. But we spend so much time in denial of what is that we don't learn how to face our fear. And that is, if maybe most importantly, that is the thing that we need to come to terms with. I wrote this the other day and posted it on my social media. It's not very profound, but it's rather simple. Right now, I said so many are sharing online our struggles and subsequent insights and epiphanies. First, we have the time. Second, we are being forced to spend time with ourselves looking inward. And that look inward is the door to all of our understanding. That is what this can do for us if we allow it, if we embrace it. It doesn't mean it's going to be painless. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be afraid. It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel grief and that you're not going to hurt. And any attempt on my part or anybody else's part to have you not feel those things is asking you to live in a world that doesn't exist for you. When my family was having a hard time saying goodbye to my father, they were trying to create a world that was more tolerable. Right? We try to take away each other's pain and we think we're doing them a service instead of learning to sit with somebody in their pain. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, talks about if you happen to be sitting bedside, which we were virtually, if you happen to be sitting bedside near somebody that you love, sit with them. Sit with them and be quiet and ask them what they would like to talk about. Because the love and the pain and the loss is all connected, right? That's what happens when we, I think I was telling somebody this just recently. I was doing an interview. You know the phrase that I share all the time by Carl Jung that says, I would rather be whole than good. I meet a lot of people in the mental health field that it seems like they would rather be good than whole. What Carl Jung was saying is it's the same thing that the Buddhist teaches, that you embrace all of it because the pain can't be separated from the joy. I remember C.S. Lewis, the movie based on his life called Shadowlands, as his wife, who he fell in love with. It's a fascinating love story. She was sick and dying. She started to talk with him. They were in this special place, and she started to talk with him about dying. And he said, let's not talk about that right now. And she said, you can't do that. You can't separate out the love that we have from the pain that we will feel when we're apart. You can't have one without the other. It really is what self-medicating is about. It's what depression is about. I used to teach my students with depression, it's like you're trying to dam up the river, but you're only trying to dam up the part of the river that is toxic, right? The unhealthy elements in the river. That doesn't work that way. When you hold back the pain, the sadness, the hurt, the loss, the grief, you also hold back the joy and the love, right? It's what gives us our meaning. And again, I go back to if we can sit with somebody, if we know somebody that has the capacity, hopefully our partner does or our parent does. Hopefully you can do that for your child. Having a therapist or a sponsor that can do that, that can just let you tell your story and that doesn't get eager to try to fix it or change it for you, then you can learn to sit with who you are at the same time. Some of the clients have been telling me that their children have said that wilderness therapy did so much to prepare them for this time. And I think that there's a reason for that because of what we were describing. No matter the difficulty, it is imperative that we develop a practice and a position of self-love. A failure to do so will turn pain and loss into unnecessary suffering. Pain is unavoidable. Loss is, if you're lucky, unavoidable. It's absolutely unavoidable. But the kind of suffering that we talk about here is avoidable. The kind of suffering that comes from trying to avoid pain and loss. So let's get into a little bit more pragmatics about what you need to know. Like I said, no two people in any kind of grief situation are suffering the same loss. Two parents that lose a child. All of us who have lost access to the outside world. No two people are experiencing the same loss. So what that asks of you, maybe more profoundly than other times, is it requires you to be present with an other. Right? To lose your mind, as I talk about in my book, to lose your mind and wake up to the idea of an other. And that's hard to do when your resources, when your serenity is depleted, is limited. And not only are two people side by side experiencing absolutely unique loss, unique from each other, unique to each other, but no two people have the same way of coping with loss, right? We all go through stages of grief and loss, and we don't go in the same pattern as the people around us. I've said this many times. That's why the first thing they teach you in grief therapy is that families that go through a grief and a loss need somebody from the outside who can hold space for them, because it's hard to be there for somebody else when they're in such a different place, such a different perspective, and are coping with it in such a different way. I found this quote and shared it more than once. This idea that said, the first thing that you should know about me is that I am not you. A lot more will make sense after that. Everything else will make sense after that. So this collective grief that we're all experiencing individually while in close quarters is unique to all of us and difficult because of that uniqueness. When grieving, we may lose the ability to provide needed resources for others, right? The reason I scaled back a little bit on some of my broadcasts to just doing a couple of weeks from going 4 weeks is I realized I needed to take in more than I was taking in. I was giving a lot out, which I loved and found connection in and beauty in, but I started to sense that I was feeling extra depleted. So with our parent support groups, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and the broadcast, I had to scale it back a little bit. Had to own my limitation. Learning to move through feelings is the key. Most of us will be tempted to go around or avoid or to not feel. In essence, therapy is helping people to feel. When I would teach my young children, my very young children who are now 27 and 25, when they were 5 years old and around that age, they would ask me what I did for a living because I'd have to go away from the house for a couple of days, and I would come smelling like the campfire. To this day, when my children smell a campfire, it reminds them of me coming home from work. Um, so I would come home and they would say, "What are you doing, Daddy? What's your job?" And I would say, "I work with the sad boys," because at that time I worked with the adolescent boys. And I say, "I work with the sad boys." And they say, "What do you do with the sad boys?" And I said, "I just try to help them feel it, help them to feel their feelings." That's essentially an oversimplified explanation of therapy. Everything that we show up that gets us into this program and therapy, the symptoms, if you will, are often our attempts to not feel or our feelings coming out sideways, leaking. So learning to move through feelings is the key. And how do you do that? You sit with somebody who can do it. We don't have a lot of models of that. Most of our parents weren't very comfortable letting us feel pain and sitting with us, remaining connected to us while we suffered. I wrote in my book that I learned to do it by sitting next to somebody who could sit in me with me in my darkness, in my fear, my anxiety, my mess. And because she sat with me, I learned to sit with myself more. You know, we can learn to lower our expectations. There's a lot being said right now about these motivational pep talks that are being given online by various people and various outlets, various mediums. Hold that lightly. There can be, for some of you, a wonderful opportunity to do those things. And for others, it's going to be a time of struggle and pain and grief and sadness. And both are okay. It's okay whether this is a time to reset for you, whether this is a time to grieve for you, whether this is a lonely time, whether this is an opportunity to express yourself creatively. It's okay. That's the biggest difference between a therapeutic approach and the average parent, right? Because the average parent wants the child to kind of make the best of it, wants the child to transcend it, wants the child to get over it, get through it, to be grateful, to be happy. The therapist just wants the person to be them. And the therapist knows that being them is the pathway to peace, healing, and enlightenment, and that they have to practice um, a great deal of compassion and patience. And that's what you're kind of learning in this process, right? That's what I'm learning in this process. I'm learning my difficulty and struggle with being kind of the old school parent, the parent that wants a child to get something out of it, and trying to become the parent, the therapist that says, it's okay, I'll sit with you in it. And then you can learn to sit with yourself and move through it yourself. So lowering expectations about, it's not even lowering expectations, it's shifting expectations. I think lowering is kind of condescending because there's no lowness in grieving. There's no lowness in depression or anxiety, right? It just is what it is. And what we try to do is we try to understand and get into it with our children, with our clients. And by getting into it and being there with them in it, they can kind of sort it out. It's really hard to sort it out on your own without that companionship, without that community. And learning your ways through the fear, not around it, but through it. Learning to feel it, learning to make sense of it. That might mean, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, various tools that are available to you. Remember that fear and anxiety are contagious. And so I think it's a critical time to monitor the amount of information that you are accessing. For a lot of us, information is usually a reduction to our anxiety, right? We become information junkies, addicts. And the more information we get, the more settled we feel. And while that can be true, and while it is true for some of us at some times, it can also be difficult in times like this when there is so much information, misinformation. There's so much bad psychology out there by people who aren't psychologists, right? And so being selective and monitoring and owning your capacity to tolerate the information is important. I over the past few years have had to be very intentional about my news, and at this point, this has been the lowest amount of news that I've watched in the past 3 years. And so even though it was intentional before this, I have to be very careful because of the the anger, the fear, the hatred, the panic that's out there. It's a weird balance to try to balance. Like, we need some information, right? I check the headlines to make sure that there's not a vaccine, that I'm not missing that announcement. I check a few things here and there, but I have to be really careful about it. And I love this idea of finding safe places to feel. It's important to find safe places to feel. One of the problems is the internet is not a safe place to feel. Social media is not a journal, and we use it like a journal sometimes, but it's not always a safe place to feel, to express yourself. Finding a person, a sponsor, a mentor, or a therapist, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but this is a difficult time if you haven't developed a practice already of using a sponsor or a therapist or a support group. Because if you don't have that practice in your life, creating one right now will be an extra challenge for you, right? It's why I've said for years, I believe my practice is therapy, going to therapy. That's the way I do it for me. And I do it when times are good because I don't know when the crisis is going to come. And I need that resource, that anchor, that reference point, that safe place to feel. I don't know. My sessions are on Fridays, Friday morning, mid-morning. And I don't know sometimes Thursday how I'm going to be doing Friday. So I have a practice of going to therapy once a week. So that is a part of my life. I want to talk about boundaries a little bit because I think this is important. Boundaries are critical to managing anxiety. Very, very critical. And they're hard work because they require us to face our shadow side, our guilt and our shame, and embrace what is within our control and create a world that feels safe to us, right? It's all we can control is our boundary and our space. And that's why one of the challenges is that you can't leave and go away. We're all in close quarters. Our children can't escape. I had a break in between my last phone call, my last Zoom call, and this webinar tonight, this broadcast tonight. And I went out just to say hi to my family outside of my office. And they were playfully joking and saying, "Don't go back in there. Don't go back in there. We're going crazy out here." And they were just being silly. And my 12-year-old daughter wouldn't let me go when I was coming in the door of my home office because that's the way it feels. That's one of the reasons why I moved them to be a little bit earlier so I could have more time tonight and every night. Boundaries are going to be critical. And again, if you haven't made boundary setting a practice, it's hard to start now. But it's the best time to start any of this work is 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The second best time is always right now. So we develop a practice. Therapy is my practice. It's my preferred way of getting these needs met. A practice in meditation can be a very valuable resource of calming the nervous system. And there are a host of meditation practice and resources. I think Oprah and Deepak Chopra just released for free some of the meditation that he's produced on a platform. You can find it online. There are apps. There's video, YouTube examples. There's books. Finding a practice of meditation to reduce our upregulation of our nervous system is important. Group support. Some of the groups that we're offering, attending these. I know these aren't interactive, but some of the ones that we have that are. But could be a 12-step group. Most everything is online right now because of the pandemic, but still, there's still connection. When I've been meeting with families, it's just been a powerful experience to meet with parents or graduates of our intensive process because we're finding solace in our connection, just seeing each other's faces. Exercise can be important because it utilizes the energy, the chemicals that get introduced to our system that are stressful, when we're under stress, right? Epinephrine, adrenaline that gets introduced into our system, cortisol that gets introduced when we're chronically stressed. Exercise burns those off, right? It metabolizes because it gets used, the muscles get use those chemicals. So exercise is important. Being careful about solutions that become a part of the problem, like alcohol, drug use, food, right? understanding that sometimes those can offer temporary relief, but if those become our go-tos, just being aware of those can become a part of the problem, part of our anxiety and our response to it. Applying timeouts. I talk about this in the 8 tools, the 8 tips podcast, the chapter in my book on the 8 tools. It's really important to own our limitations and to take timeouts. Nobody responds well when their nervous system is upregulated. It's physiological. We lose access to our highest, calmest thinking. So timeouts is the simplest way to interrupt those. And taking timeouts, even as mother and father, take timeouts yourself. When you think somebody else needs a timeout, consider taking one yourself first. Has the same effect. Sitting with yourself and learning to feel it, knowing it's there. I put on here The Dance of Fear by Dr. Harriet Lerner is a great resource to look at anxiety. So what are my take-home points? Self-compassion, self-compassion, self-compassion. Practice self-compassion. It is perhaps the most important part of dealing with this pandemic. Being kind to yourself, and your fallible human self is just that. It's just a fallible human self. And you're not going to be, everybody on planet, every human being that has ever lived will have some of their response, performance, abilities become compromised under duress and stress. A limited amount of stress sometimes can be helpful for some people, for most people. But chronic stress, significant stress, few outlets, it can become, our ability to cope, to deal with, becomes compromised and limited. Finding resources, community, and support. It's very important. I said this since we started doing these during the pandemic. It's very important that you find ways to get yourself supported, because even if you were doing well before this, and some of us were struggling before this in various ways, this is something that we're all dealing with. I always look over here because that's the window to the outside world. There's a threat out there, a real threat. It's COVID. And the world is a little bit less safe because of it. And so we're going to need to draw upon more resources. And I've said this several times, which is, this is in the way that a lot of our clients, our students, feel all the time before COVID, right? This is the way the world feels to them often, long before the pandemic. And now we have some empathy for why they want to escape and self-medicate. Try to avoid, owning your limitations and developing self-care practices, right? It's okay to not be all capable. This really requires us to confront our humanness, right? Our fallibility, our limitedness. So learning to practice owning those and embracing those, and avoiding the I can handle anything mistake. That's some kind of goal. I know as a parent, it seems like this is a big principle that I talk about all the time. Children to develop well do not need an all-capable parent. They do not. And it's impossible. So good. I'm glad they don't need it. What they need is a parent who is capable of owning their limitations and doesn't make it about the child. It's not about having resources and abilities that are infinite. It's about knowing what's yours and what's not yours. And that takes a lot of courage for most of us. And take on less, including the suffering of others. Right? That's something that we start to surrender. We don't have to take that on. It's not ours. We develop the muscle that I call it is we develop the muscle of empathic misery. Right? We get better and better at sitting with somebody, empathizing with somebody, and suffering along with them in their pain. All right, I'm happy to answer any questions or comments. Someone says, thank you so much. This is a huge contribution to me. Unfortunately, I have another meeting at 8:30. I'll catch up with the rest on the replay. Well, glad you joined us for a little bit. I'm going to go to I have some new announcements tonight that you haven't seen before. So I'm going to go to those and then we can go to questions at the end. Someone says, oh, that was from earlier. We are now doing online support groups. So the next one will be Wednesday, April 15th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And then Thursday, May 6th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And then I'll be doing an intensive support group at Wednesday, April 22nd, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. So these will all be done during Zoom. This was planned before COVID. So we're going to be doing a few of these each month for you to tune into. All these are going to be via Zoom. Contact Malia, Malia, Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. Our parent workshops on site are temporarily suspended. This is another place you can get support. These are all now going online, 12-step support groups. Go to alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org to find out about meetings in your area that are virtual or online. Also, alanon.alateen.org is for teenagers. Refugerecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program. NAMI, standing for the National Alliance on Mental Illness.org, is a great place you can go, and they're offering online classes, resources in your area. These are local chapters. So feel free to go to those. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or by going to soundcloud.com on your computer. Twitter and Instagram, find Evoke Therapy on Twitter and Instagram by using the handle @EvokeTherapy. Find the intensive program by using the intensive handle Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram. Search Evoke Therapy programs on Facebook. And the Evoke Family Foundation is also on Facebook to help people they raise money to help people who can't afford therapy. And also the Evoke Therapy blog. Both of my books are available on Amazon. I've reduced the prices during the pandemic to the lowest possible price on Amazon. The new one, The Audacity to Be You, is as low as $2.99. That's the lowest they would allow me to sell it for, the ebook version, and $10.02 for the print version. All right, some questions have come up, comments. Someone says, thank you so much for this. It's a huge contribution. I already read that one. Could you please tell us more about parents that are able to own their limitations? Yeah, I've written about this. It's in the new book. It's just saying I can't. I'm not able to. I'm struggling. I need to take care of myself. It's really learning to say no, I can't. It's learning to set boundaries. The big shift is in boundary setting is you stop setting boundaries from a place of this is what's best for you to this is what's best for me and what I need. That's the biggest practical difference. So if I'm talking about a child, and it could be in another relationship like a spouse or a friend, the boundary is here's what I need for me to feel okay versus here's what I need for you to feel okay. Like you have to do this thing, or I have to do this thing to affect and control you. So it's learning to take care of yourself. That's the transformation into this recovery from codependency is we learn it's okay to take care of ourselves. We learn that that's our responsibility and virtually nobody else's. At least it's not their primary responsibility, it's ours. So that's what it looks like. It's talking about what you need to be okay. And then by doing better self-care, then you're able to be there more for the people that you love. The simple example. It's a simple example. And it's not a very deep one. But my wife and I decided about 8 years ago that we were going to make several shifts. One of the shifts that I made that I travel when we were allowed to travel. I used to travel a lot for work, right? Visiting cities, doing outreach, providing parent workshops and so forth. And when I would travel, especially to New York, for example, or Los Angeles, specifically, I would stay an extra day instead of taking the late flight home. I would stay and go to a show or a baseball or a basketball game. I could have taken the late flight home. My early practice was to take that late flight home from New York and get home at 11:45, which is 1:45 New York time, and start work back up the next day at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And I was burning the candle at both ends. And so when I started to practice better self-care, My wife encouraged it also. I would say, hey, look, I'm going to stay and go to a show or go to a, I'm from Los Angeles, so I would go to an Angels game or a Lakers game. And she knew it and I knew it. And I would have to admit, even to this day, I still feel a little guilty when I do that because I spend a lot of time away from home. But I have to be willing to sort out that guilt to take care of myself. Otherwise, I'm going to end up angry and resentful and empty. And then I come home the next day. Excuse me. I come home the next day, often not on the early flight, and I have more to give for those that I love. So that's what it means. It means owning it and taking care of yourself and not waiting for and hoping for everybody else to take care of you. It's not saying to your child that you need to get better so I'm okay. It's saying, I'm going to take care of myself first so I can be there for you. It's being responsible for your own serenity and fighting and doing battle with the guilt and shame that come with self-care. That's what it means. Somebody says, Brad, thank you for such a wonderful session. It was a refreshing boost and an opportune time. You're absolutely welcome. Someone says, thank you for this broadcast. It was perfect for me just now. I don't think I have been in more of a mess. We're in this together. You might be struggling, but we're all in this together. And so I'm very, very glad that you joined and that it was helpful. Somebody says, how do you get past the guilt of self-care? For example, my spouse is starting to express feelings of resentment and neglect because I have been taking more time and working my program since recently getting a sponsor, attending extra meetings and connecting to my support group. He is not understanding that I am doing this for me. He has commented that I was becoming obsessed with my son's addiction. Yeah, that's what happens. That's what happens when we set boundaries. And Dr. Lerner calls it the countermoves. She says, expect and anticipate change back messages. And she gives lots of examples. The Dance of Anger is a really good resource for the person who wrote that question because it gives examples of specifically women starting to practice self-care and men getting angry and calling them self-absorbed and selfish. You have to do battles with the dragon of fear and shame to be able to find yourself. And we get told that we are pathological, selfish, self-interested by people that love us to get us back in line with what they need. That's what happens. I will say this emphatically. I have yet to have an experience or observe an experience where somebody does not have to battle significantly their guilt to practice healthy self-care and love and to do boundaries. I don't know what self-care looks like for all of you, but I do know this. If you're not doing battle with guilt, you're probably not practicing self-care. If you're not letting somebody down, dropping a ball, failing, you're probably not doing good self-care. Probably not improving on it. I'm sure there are exceptions to that idea, but I just haven't encountered them. So thank you. Dance of Anger is a great podcast and book on the subject. Somebody says, living at home with our child who is on the cusp of adulthood, I'm having difficulty with setting boundaries when she sets up an old pattern. I get fearful about what some of her behaviors at home will look like out in the real world and the rejection that she will experience when she treats others like she treats us. How can I better draw a boundary between us other than using I statements? That's a great question. I statements aren't a boundary. I would not use them as a boundary. Go to the broadcast on 8 tools. I statements are not to be used as a boundary. A boundary is no. A boundary is this is what I'm going to do. I statements are really sometimes a substitute for a boundary. They're what drives the boundary, but they are not a boundary. So I'm glad you brought that up because I talk about that in the first book a lot. That when we use our feelings, our statement feelings to try to get others to change, we're using emotional coercion instead of setting healthy boundaries. You said it in your question. It was perfectly said in your question, which is this. The way to prepare her for other people's reactions is for you to have a reaction, right? You have to show up as a self with needs, limits, emotions, right? You have to show up as a self for them to recognize what it is to be in relationship to a self. I talk a lot about being an adequate container and increasing bandwidth. I talk about that a lot. But there's another error on the other side of that equation. That is too much bandwidth or having too big of a container. They need to feel you and your human limitations. They need to feel the boundaries that you establish because you're frustrated or exhausted or overwhelmed. And when they have to deal, think about this, when they have to deal with an other, then they learn what it means to go out in the world and deal with an other. So you said it in your question. She's not learning because she doesn't have to live. She lives with a mother who's trying to be loving and capable, or father, or both sets, trying to be loving and capable and shoulder as much as possible. That's not the deal. The first deal in developing healthy attachment is you finding you and the edges and the limits of you. That's the first task, is having a self and showing up as a self. And then for a lot of us, it's learning to be patient with another. But it starts with self. So I would say, be a self. Learn to be you more and more and more. And it's a complex, it's a life's journey, but that's the first task. And then she'll learn that, shoot, there are other people in the world that I have to deal with. And this one right here called mom or dad, this pain in the butt, limited, fallible, gets angry sometimes, throws a tantrum sometimes, says no a lot of the times, sets all kinds of limits. I have to deal with that out in the world. So thank you. Somebody says, I love that shift of I need you to get better in order for me to feel better, to I need to take care of myself. I struggle with that. Yep. This is how I came to know that. What would you say to a kid who comes back from Evoke to this? The temptations for self-destructive behaviors, marijuana, screens, isolation will be huge. Boundaries. Just boundaries. And listening. I used to have this picture I would put on these broadcasts, on the visual part of these broadcasts, where it would be a brick wall. The whole slide was a brick wall, and then there was a big ear on it. That's two of the features that our children need, is they need to have our limits, right? That means that they're encountering another self, but at the same time, they need compassion and listening. One of the things I talk about at Evoke that we try to practice is that the rules are pretty rigid at Evoke. But the listening ear is pretty large. Like, you're allowed to hate us. And that's the gift of having somebody else do it, right? The reason why I'm a better coach for my child and you're a better coach for my child, and I'm a better coach for your child, right? So often the case. I think everybody can relate to that. Sometimes the coach is better than you are at working with your child. And honestly, you guys would be better than me at some of coaching my children, for sure, because I'm not tied into them feeling or thinking a certain thing about me, your child. I am with my own child, but not with your child. And so they get to be a person. I'm not as compromised by their anger or their hurt or their disappointment. I get asked the question all the time, will my child forgive me? That fear is not an asset to you or to the child. It's not their job to forgive you. That's your wound that you've got to deal with, right? It's your job to love them and to get that sense of serenity and peace about you as a person from somebody else, not them. So what I would say is I would talk to you about your work. Talk to you about living your healthiest, most authentic life. Talk to you about your childhood wounds and how they get in the way of doing that. Because this is not about raising good children, right? This is about showing up as a parent as authentic and as capable as we can, and then helping the child get to where they need to go. Not subjugating our needs, right? It wouldn't be healthy for a child if a parent subjugated their needs all the time for the child. It's just not ideal. They wouldn't learn how to be in a relationship with somebody. So that's what I would say. It wouldn't be about what you say. It's about how you show up. Limits, boundaries, self, compassion, listening ear, curious ear at the same time. All right. Looks like that's it for the questions. Uh, Let me make sure. Yep. All right, folks. The next one, this is important because this is not just for you. You can attend it, but the next one is an open forum um, for extended family, siblings, and friends of Evoke. I want to go back because did I miss this? An announcement? I don't think I have the intensives on here, do I? I thought I had that on here, Malia. I messed up again. So we're doing online intensives. We're doing online intensives. I think I think it might be filled already. We opened it on Friday and it filled in half of a day. I think it's full. You can inquire, but I'm pretty sure it's full. But we have another one. We're doing one on January. So it's from your home. It's led by me and my daughter, Emma. She's my co-facilitator is for all of these. We're going to be leading an intensive program from a Friday afternoon through the evening and then all day Saturday and all day Sunday. We'll have breaks and breaks for meals and so forth, but it's an online intensive. This will be our first one, April 24th, and then the second one is May 8th, I believe. Isn't that right? So May 8th. So if you're interested, please sign up soon because these will fill up fast. We're going to continue to do these after COVID. We think that it won't take you a lot of time and resources away from home. So we're going to do that. But yeah, I forgot to post that on there. I'm sorry, guys. But I'll be doing another one of these for family and friends this Thursday evening, April 16th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So please join us. Invite your friends, invite your family, invite extended family if they want to see what we do. Ask questions. You can ask questions about them. You can have siblings ask questions. You can have grandparents, uncles, aunts, anybody come on, or you can ask questions that you give to them. So May 8th through 10th is the intensive. Inquire at intensivs@evoketherapy.com. Intensives@evoketherapy.com. And the next available one will be May 8th through 10th. I believe you can ask, but I believe the April 24th through 26th is closed for now. It is. All right. Thanks for joining us, folks. I hope this was helpful. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you in a couple of days on Thursday. Bye-bye.